All our stories are created for entertainment purposes only. Story 2. Back in 2019, I was a high school senior, and my sister, who was 15 at the time, was a freshman. We lived with our parents, who had been married for 2 decades. My dad worked as a lawyer in Manhattan, and my mom ran a boutique in Queens. Our home was situated on the border of Queens and Long Island. Before I delve into the story, let me emphasize that my mom had always been a loving and involved mother. I cherished her more than anything in the world. Now, in 2019, both my dad and I started noticing some unusual behavior from my mom. She began spending time with much younger colleagues, indulging in expensive designer clothing like Chanel and Christian Dior, and even getting her lips done. She started taking frequent, lavish trips to Europe, excluding both my dad and me, but occasionally taking my sister along. My dad grew increasingly concerned about the time she spent away from home. One day she claimed she had to stay late at work, but she didn't return home until 4 a.m. the next morning. That's when my dad decided to check her phone, and he discovered explicit messages with another man, and even videos of them engaged in intimate activities. A massive, explosive argument erupted between my parents. All I can remember is my dad asking her whether she wanted to be with this other man or stay with her family. She kept repeating, "I don't know," over and over again. Later, my dad came to me and disclosed what was happening, showing me some of the messages they had exchanged, and a part of a video that I wish I had never seen. It shattered me to witness her betrayal. At this point, my dad, who had been sober from alcohol for nearly 15 years, started drinking again. He came home drunk, slept on the couch, and I had never seen him in such disarray before. It was heartbreaking to witness this transformation because he had always been a well-put-together man, especially as a lawyer. A few days later, around 9 p.m., he said he was going to the bar to see some friends and would be back in a few hours. I went to sleep, but in the middle of the night, my mom woke me and my sister up, crying, and said we needed to go to the hospital. Unfortunately, my dad was driving drunk on the way home and had a head-on collision with a guardrail on the highway, going at 94 miles per hour. By the time we reached the scene, he had already been pronounced dead. In that moment, my entire world crumbled. I realized I had lost the most important person in my life, and I held my mom responsible for it. A strong hatred towards her welled up inside me, and I remained silent until his wake, which took place about 10 days later. During the wake, my mom introduced me to a man named John. Immediately, I knew it was my mom's affair partner because I remembered the name from the texts my dad had shown me. It was Johnny. My mom had portrayed him as a close friend. To make matters worse, I watched that guy kneel at my father's coffin and say a prayer over his lifeless body. After the wake, I unleashed all my anger on my mother. I called her every insult in the book. For the next 4 months, I tried to make her hate me as much as I hated her, but she never wavered. She told me she loved me every day and insisted that she'd always be there for me, which only fueled my frustration. About 30 days after my dad's funeral, she started openly dating Johnny. She couldn't even wait for her husband of 20 years to be laid to rest. At that point, I completely stopped talking to her, except when hurling insults her way. I was into baseball and managed to secure a Division I scholarship for it, which led me to a California school. Despite my mother's wishes for me to stay closer to home, I chose California. Once I left and arrived at school, I cut off all contact with her, blocked her number, and severed ties on social media. It's been almost 5 years since I've heard her voice. I knew I had my dad's parents to fall back on financially, so cutting contact wasn't too challenging. Initially, she sent letters for the first 18 months, but she stopped when she realized I wasn't budging. A year after my departure, she moved Johnny and his daughters into our family home, which my dad had bought with his own hard-earned money. I suppose it's their home now. I used to have a relationship with my sister, but when Johnny and his daughters moved in, my sister became friends with them since they were around the same age. My sister and Johnny's oldest daughter now attend the same college and are in the same sorority at Monmouth University in New Jersey. When I found out about this, I cut ties with my sister as well. I've heard that my mom and Johnny got engaged a few months ago, and honestly, I want nothing to do with it. Right now, I'm writing this from my grandparents', my dad's parents' house in Florida, where I've spent every holiday for the past 5 years. Earlier today, I came across a picture on Instagram that my cousin posted. It featured my cousin, my aunt and uncle, my mom, my sister Johnny, and his daughters. Apparently, they were on vacation in the Swiss Alps, enjoying skiing and snowboarding. It struck me that this was the first time I had seen her face in 5 years, and I have to admit it made me miss her a little bit. I have to be honest here. Before all of this happened, she was a wonderful mother whom I loved deeply. I was a complete mama's boy before this mess unfolded. Lately, I've started to miss her a lot. A part of me wants to forgive her and reconnect, but I can't shake this feeling of betraying my father's honor by doing so. The guilt of forgiving her weighs heavily on me because of my father. I'm truly lost on what to do. So Reddit, I turn to you for advice. Should I forgive and reconnect with my mother, or should I stay away to honor my father's memory? What's the right path for me to take? I've ruined my once happy marriage because of my selfish desires. I can't even comprehend how I ended up in this mess. It feels like everything unraveled so quickly and I'm filled with shame right now. I've committed something truly terrible and I can't even face myself in the mirror. I doubt I'll ever forgive myself for having an affair with my husband's friend. I take full responsibility for all of this. My desires got the best of me, and I couldn't control myself. What should I do now? I'm completely lost and confused. Hey everyone, I'm Anne, a 30-year-old fashion designer. I've been into fashion since I was 16, but I learned the basics from my mom, who was also a fashion designer. I've been a professional fashion designer for a decade now. I'm married to a medical doctor named Derek, who's 32 years old. We live in Rochester, New York, USA, and we've been married for 5 years. Derek means the world to me. He's my soulmate and the love of my life. We met in college and have been inseparable ever since. Some people might think I married Derek for his money, but that's far from the truth. I won't blame them for assuming that because, to be honest, Derek isn't conventionally handsome and he's on the shorter side. But none of that matters to me. What drew me to Derek was his incredible kindness. Without a doubt, Derek loves me more than he loves himself, and he goes above and beyond to make me happy. He'd do anything to see me smile. Our relationship hit a rough patch when Derek was relocated to a nearby town 6 months ago. He asked if we could move together, but I used my fashion designing business as an excuse to stay put. The truth is, I couldn't fathom starting over in a remote town, especially since Derek volunteered for an NGO and would be away for 2 years. It was a challenging situation for both of us. I explained to Derek that I really wanted to join him, but my business commitments prevented me from doing so. He understood my reasons, but I could sense his disappointment in his expression. He reassured me that he'd visit once a month, and I agreed. Little did I know that being apart would create such a significant rift in our marriage. The distance became a problem, and even keeping in touch became a challenge due to Derek's busy schedule. Nevertheless, he made an effort to communicate with me occasionally. Derek made sure that we stayed in touch at least 3 times a day, and we had daily video calls. He kept his promise by visiting me at least once a month. Over time, I started feeling increasingly bored, even though Derek was my best friend, and we used to do everything together. It became tough for me to cope with the loneliness. I longed for someone to be by my side. One day, as I was returning from the grocery store, a car suddenly pulled up, and the driver approached me. His face looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. He introduced himself as Nathan, Derek's friend, and suddenly I remembered him as one of Derek's groomsmen at our wedding. He inquired about Derek, and I informed him that Derek had been away on NGO work for about 6 months. He offered to give me a ride home since my car was in the shop, and after some hesitation, I accepted. During the ride, we had a blast, and I lost track of time, only realizing we had arrived at my doorstep. Nathan insisted on helping me carry the groceries inside, which I appreciated. He came in, assisted me with organizing the groceries, and I offered him a cup of coffee. We continued to chat and have a good time. Nathan is undeniably good-looking, and his company was enjoyable. He's 6 feet tall and could easily pass for a model. Eventually, he suggested leaving, but I convinced him to stay a bit longer since we had time. We decided to share a glass of wine and watch a movie together. That's all I recall, folks. I was utterly unprepared for what transpired next. When I woke up the next morning, I found Nathan in my marital bed. I know it's shocking, but believe me, I was just as stunned. I can't recall any of the details, but one thing was clear. I had slept with my husband's friend, and I had no idea how it happened. I was completely crushed, but Nathan acted like nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. While I was panicking, he remained composed. He told me to calm down, reassuring me that it was quite common, and I wouldn't be the first person to sleep with a friend of my husband. He emphasized that he hadn't taken advantage of me, and that everything that happened was consensual. Well, I was too drunk to recollect anything from that night, but he offered to whip up some breakfast. Initially, I asked him to leave immediately, but he declined and insisted on preparing breakfast. I was still feeling the effects of the previous night's drinking, so I didn't have much energy to do anything about it. I felt lost and didn't know how to handle the situation. I felt terrible and was not proud of my actions. Derek didn't deserve this. I couldn't fathom how I had allowed myself to stoop so low and have an affair with my husband's friend. I constantly questioned my choices because I didn't think Derek could ever forgive me for what I had done. His greatest fear had become a reality. Derek had trust issues stemming from past relationships where women had been attracted to his wealth and eventually cheated on him. I had reassured him that I was different and would never do such a thing to him. Initially, Derek doubted my love for him, thinking it was solely because of his money. Slowly, I gained his trust and helped him see his worth beyond financial status. Now, I couldn't believe I had shattered that trust. How could I convince Derek that I had lost control? I knew he might view me as just another one of his previous partners. I was terrified because I recognized the magnitude of my wrongdoing. I was still grappling with what to do when Nathan entered with a tray of food. I was furious, but I couldn't muster the courage to ask him to leave. He offered me breakfast, and I accepted. He tried to console me, reassuring me that everything would eventually be all right. I felt immense guilt because despite knowing I could have stopped, I kept making the wrong choices. My affair with Nathan continued, and although I was fully aware of its wrongness, I couldn't find the strength to put an end to it. Nathan and I grew so close that he moved in with me. Derek's visits became less frequent due to his demanding work schedule, but he made sure we stayed in touch daily. Whenever Derek called, Nathan would make himself scarce so that I could comfortably converse with him. It felt strange initially, but over time, I adapted to the situation. One day I received an unexpected call from Derek. He mentioned having a surprise for me, and I assumed it was another package he had sent. I rushed to the door when he instructed me to open it, and the shock that awaited me was beyond anything I had imagined. I stood there, frozen for a moment, and Derek had to tap me to bring me back to reality. He could sense my lack of enthusiasm upon seeing him. He inquired why I wasn't thrilled to see him, and I knew I had to act quickly to avoid getting caught. I contemplated lying about being sick, but I remembered that Derek was a medical doctor, making that lie easily debunked. So I had to come up with a different excuse. I told him I was experiencing severe menstrual cramps, knowing that he was aware of how painful they could be. So Derek suggested I take a break and relax. Everything was going smoothly, and I was fully immersed in enjoying the attention and care I was receiving from Derek. I didn't have a moment to contemplate the mess I had created. Little did I know, a storm was brewing. Derek went upstairs to change his clothes, but he stumbled upon Nathan's belongings in his closet. From clothes to undershirts and underwear, Derek was furious, and his anger was evident in his tone when he spoke to me. In that moment, I wished I could vanish into thin air. I knew this could spell the end for me. I wanted to confess, but I couldn't muster the courage. I was convinced that Derek would never forgive me if I admitted to having an affair with his friend. So I held my secret tight, and miraculously, I didn't get caught. When Derek asked about the items he found in his closet, I spun a web of lies. I told him they belonged to my brother, who happened to be in town for work. He questioned why I hadn't mentioned it to him before, given that we spoke every day. I claimed it must have slipped my mind. He continued probing, asking why my brother's belongings were in his closet. At that moment, it was clear he wasn't buying my fabricated tales, and he wasn't going to let it slide. I resorted to saying that I was helping my busy brother with his laundry. From the look on Derek's face, it was evident he didn't believe every word I uttered. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I even accused him of not trusting me. I felt immense shame for my actions and couldn't believe how low I had sunk. Derek wiped away my tears and apologized, never bringing up the matter again. As soon as Derek left, I hurriedly called Nathan, instructing him not to return because Derek had come back. I felt relieved that Nathan wasn't home when Derek returned. I saw it as the universe working in my favor. However, throughout Derek's presence, I pretended to be happy while secretly battling guilt. Seeing Derek reminded me of why I married him and why I had turned down numerous proposals to be with him. It was at that moment that the gravity of my actions hit me. Here was a man who would do anything for me, a man who had defied his own family to be with me, a man who had fulfilled every request I made. He was the one who stood by my side when others labeled me a gold digger. He was the man who had transformed my life. How had I allowed myself to have an affair with his friend? I felt completely disconnected from everything and overwhelmed with exhaustion. Update. Derek noticed that something was amiss, and he repeatedly asked me what was bothering me. However, I couldn't summon the courage to reveal the truth to him. I was terrified of what the consequences would be. Guilt gnawed at me for betraying Derek. It wasn't a conscious choice, but how could I possibly explain to him that it was loneliness that drove me into the arms of his friend? Let me be clear. I take full responsibility for everything that unfolded, but I can't deny that I might not have ended up with Nathan if Derek hadn't been relocated. I could sense Derek growing suspicious, especially when I caught him checking our CCTV camera footage. Thankfully, I was savvy enough to disable it whenever Nathan was around. Derek was keeping a close watch on my every move, even going through my phone, though I had erased all call logs and messages, which only fueled his suspicions. I suppose he was searching for concrete evidence before confronting me. His anxiety escalated when my brother failed to return. Remember when I fibbed to Derek about my brother being in town? Well, I had to concoct another story. I informed him that my brother had been urgently called away for work in another city. Before Derek left, he shared his plan to resign and open his own medical clinic, putting an end to his travels so we could start a family. Derek and I had always dreamt of having children, but due to his NGO commitments, it wasn't feasible. We agreed to wait until he was more settled, as he was determined to be an active part of our kids' lives. It was a mix of emotions for me. On one hand, I was overjoyed at the prospect of finally starting a family. On the other hand, I was burdened by the guilt of my affair with Nathan. Would Derek still want to have children with me once he discovered I had been intimate with his friend? I knew he wouldn't. I knew the man I married was unforgiving. He had never forgiven any of his ex-girlfriends who had cheated on him. What chance did I stand as his wife? I was acutely aware of the painstaking effort it took to rebuild Derek's trust, and now I had shattered it all. Derek returned to formally resign, and I resolved to end things with Nathan. I decided to meet him outside my house, but then I remembered some of his belongings were still inside. So I called him over to break things off officially. I informed him that it was over and that I couldn't continue our relationship. He pressed for an explanation for my sudden change of heart, but I firmly stated it was none of his business and urged him to retrieve his belongings and leave. Nathan begrudgingly began packing his things, predicting that I'd regret my decision one day and come back begging. I assured him that such a day would never come. Amid our exchange, my phone rang, and I glanced at the caller ID, discovering it was Derek. My heart practically leaped out of my chest. I gave Nathan a signal to excuse me, and he obliged. I answered the call, and Derek mentioned he was checking in on me and letting me know he had officially resigned. I felt elated, and our conversation continued. For a moment, I completely forgot that Nathan was still around, lurking in the background. As I was chatting with Derek on the phone, Nathan walked in with a loud, angry tone, announcing he had packed his stuff and was leaving. In that instant, I felt like my world was collapsing. Nathan must have assumed my call was over because Derek and I typically had brief conversations due to his demanding work schedule. I prayed that Derek hadn't overheard what Nathan had said, but my hopes were dashed when Derek inquired about Nathan's presence in our house. How could he have recognized the voice? I had assumed they were just casual acquaintances. I forgot to mention one thing about Derek. He has an uncanny ability to remember faces and voices. It's one of his distinctive traits. As I was struggling to process everything, he asked again what Nathan was doing in our home. I was too stunned to utter a word. I never imagined I'd get caught, at least not like this, and certainly not right after ending things with Nathan. My mind drew a blank and I couldn't conjure up another lie. Derek revealed that he knew I had been unfaithful when I tried to pass off the clothes in his closet as my brother's, and when he discovered I had disabled the CCTV camera. He suspected my infidelity, but what he didn't know was that I had been cheating with his friend. Tears streamed down my face uncontrollably at that moment. He instructed me to leave his house before he returned. I couldn't fathom my predicament, and it felt as if my world had crumbled to pieces. Leaving Derek's house wasn't an option. I mean, where would I even go? Returning to my parents' home was out of the question. What would I tell them had transpired? So I chose to ignore the consequences and wait for Derek. I hoped he might forgive me when he learned that loneliness had driven me to betray him with his friend. However, my hopes were shattered when Derek arrived, seething with anger. I had never seen him like this before. His fury intensified upon seeing me still there. He demanded to know why I was lingering in the house and threatened to involve the police, claiming I was trespassing. My pleas fell on deaf ears, and he ordered me to gather everything I had brought with me 5 years ago when I moved into his house, emphasizing that I shouldn't take anything he had purchased for me, down to the slippers and hairpins. I got down on my knees and started pleading desperately. I begged him to forgive me and give our relationship another chance, but he remained stubborn and didn't listen to a word I said. He even vowed to make my life difficult. I tried everything I could, but Derek was unwavering in his decision. What made it even worse was that I couldn't reach out to anyone for help because I would have to spill all the details, and I knew no one would truly understand my situation, not even my friends. They always told me how fortunate I was to be married to such a loving, kind, and generous man. Throughout our marriage, Derek made sure I lacked nothing, and money was never a problem. When I saw how resolute Derek was, I packed a few of my belongings and left, unaware that it would be the last time I set foot in our marital home. I sought refuge at my fashion store, hoping to resolve things with Derek the next day. I temporarily closed down the store and sent my employees home. Right now, I'm trying to gather my thoughts and figure out what steps to take. I desperately want my husband back in my life. Update. It's still a complete mystery to me how my life took such a sudden turn. I mean, how did I go from living in a luxurious mansion to squatting in my own store? It all happened so swiftly, and it felt surreal, like a bad dream that I wished I could wake up from. After spending several days sleeping at my fashion store, the reality of my changed life hit me hard, and I cried profusely. I was so consumed by my thoughts that I didn't even realize when I dozed off the next day. I was awakened by the ringing of my phone, and it was our lawyer on the line. He wanted to meet with me, and I asked him to come to the store. To my utter shock, he arrived with divorce papers in hand. I couldn't believe my eyes. He requested that I sign the divorce papers, but I vehemently refused. I attempted to call Derek, only to discover that he had blocked my number. Determined to confront him in person, I began preparing to go to our house. However, just as I was getting ready, a group of people arrived at the store, and the lawyer introduced them as the new owners. I was utterly flabbergasted, and it took all my remaining strength to stay on my feet. Apparently, Derek had sold my store and donated the proceeds to charity. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Why would Derek do this to me? I never imagined he was capable of such a deceitful act. While it's true he initially financed the store with his money after we got married, I was the one who put in all the hard work to turn it into what it is today. How could he simply discard all my efforts? His name was on the ownership papers, but I never once thought we'd end up in a divorce. The new owners of my store gave me a 24-hour deadline to vacate the premises. I felt fortunate at first, thinking I could use that time to convince Derek to forgive me and change his mind. I left the store and headed to Derek's place, but I was met with yet another shocking revelation. Derek had sold our house, and I was denied entry. That's when it hit me that I'd lost everything. I didn't have the luxury to wallow in self-pity because it was evident that Derek was determined to make things as difficult as possible for me. I made numerous attempts to call him, but my calls never went through. Eventually, I had no choice but to sign the divorce papers and accept that it was time to move forward with my life. I left the store and decided to stay at a hotel. However, I encountered another shock when my card was declined. It turned out Derek had struck again, wiping out everything from our joint account. We had opened that account together with my suggestion, as Derek earned more, and it allowed me access to his funds for shopping and such. That day, I experienced the most embarrassing moment of my life, with the hotel receptionist nearly making a scene. I had to leave before things got worse. Here I am now, folks, homeless, divorced, and without a dime to my name. I'll only receive alimony once the divorce is finalized. It hit me then that my life had truly hit rock bottom, and it was my own actions that had led me here. With no other options and nowhere to turn, I decided to reach out to Nathan. Initially, he ignored my calls, but eventually picked up after multiple tries. I asked if we could meet to talk, and he initially claimed to be busy. However, when I explained my dire situation, being homeless and in desperate need of a place to stay, he admitted he wasn't in town. I inquired if I could go to his house, but he dropped yet another bombshell. He had a girlfriend now and suggested I move on with my life. He told me it was just a casual thing and not to take it too seriously. Nathan went on to explain how he once bumped into Derek at a bar and they were discussing relationships and infidelity. He mentioned that Derek had been praising me, saying he trusted me completely and believed I'd never cheat on him. So Nathan decided to test if Derek's words held true, and regrettably, I fell for his scheme. Hearing Nathan's words made me feel utterly ashamed of myself. I suddenly felt tainted and wondered how I could have allowed myself to be deceived so easily. No matter how much I tried, I couldn't forgive myself for the terrible mistake I had made. My self-condemnation drove me into a deep depression. Life lost its meaning, and I couldn't even reach Derek to apologize for betraying his trust and causing him pain. I made the decision to pick up the pieces of my life. I returned to my parents' home in Chicago and joined my mom in her store. The news of my infidelity quickly spread throughout the town. It was hard to accept that just a few months ago, I was living like royalty in a grand palace, and now I found myself in a small town, relying on my parents for everything. I couldn't even afford basic necessities like underwear. My life had transformed into a nightmare since the day I had an affair with my husband's friend. The fleeting lust was never worth the tremendous loss I had experienced, and it never will be. I'm overwhelmed with regret, but I know it's too late to undo the damage. If only I had never gone grocery shopping on that fateful day. If only I had never crossed paths with Nathan. And if only I had resisted falling for his deceitful tricks. That's how I destroyed my marriage and my life.